You may have a few.
What's the question again?
Ray, you may have a few more that pop on like that.
Jennifer has a very loyal crowd.
Way to increase your influence.
So good afternoon, everybody, and good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. We're just going to wait a minute or two before getting started, and then we'll get the ball rolling. Thanks for joining us here. All right, I see our attendees list is filled up a little bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name is John Winton. I'm the president of the Fordham Irish Law Students Association. Welcome to our panel today. Really glad to have you all with us. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a couple of quick thank yous. First and foremost, thank you to our panelists. You'll meet them in a little while, so I won't introduce them, but thank you all for being here to talk about this timely an important topic, something that we were able to discuss a few years ago in person at Fordham, and hoping to continue that conversation today and keep continuing that conversation in the future. I would also like to thank, of course, Dean Feerick, who was helpful in putting this event together, and Professor Michael Martin, our faculty advisor, who was able to put us in contact with all these great panelists to join us here today. We'd also like to thank the Leitner Center as well as the Fordham Law Ireland program for co-sponsoring our program and helping with outreach. We were really blown away by the number of people registering, so really appreciate their assistance as well. A quick plug for our club: if you are a Fordham student and would like to join the Fordham Irish Law Students Association, or would like to join our email list as a member of the greater community, I'll put our email in the chat. Feel free to send me a note, and we'd be happy to have you included. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor John Rogan, who will be moderating our discussion today. We do have the Q&A function enabled. Later on in the conversation, I know John will be fielding a few of those questions to the panel, so please feel free to contribute some questions in that way. John, over to you. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, John. And thanks to you and the Irish Law Students Association for organizing this program. As John mentioned, my name is John Rogan. I'm a visiting clinical professor at Fordham Law. And actually next semester, Professor John Feerick and I are launching a clinic where Fordham Law students will analyze legal and governance issues related to Northern Ireland. So that makes me especially excited for our panel today on the future of Northern Ireland and the variety of possibilities and challenges that Brexit has presented. It's an especially timely discussion as the deadline for the end of the UK's transition out of the EU approaches in just a few weeks at the end of the year. Now, we're incredibly grateful to have an excellent panel this afternoon, and I'll introduce them right now in alphabetical order. Professor Martin Flaherty is the Leitner Family Professor at Fordham Law School. He's also the co-director of the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice. He has experience going back decades working on legacy and human rights issues in Northern Ireland. Jennifer Franco Crawford is the president of the Brehon Law Society of New York. The Brehon Society is an organization primarily of lawyers that's dedicated to the defense of human rights in Northern Ireland. Professor Colin Harvey is a professor of human rights law at Queen's University Belfast. He's also a fellow at Queen's University's Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice, and he's an associate fellow at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University. Professor Harvey is a leading scholar on the constitutional and human rights issues implicated in the discussions of Northern Ireland's future. Professor Katie Hayward is a professor of political sociology at Queen's University Belfast. Like Professor Harvey, she's a fellow at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute, as well as a senior fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe initiative. Over the past 2 decades, she's focused her indispensable scholarship on the impact of the EU on the Irish border and peace process. She's also received many awards, including recently the Christopher Ewart Biggs Literary Prize for the political and sociological account of Brexit that she's provided through her Twitter account. And finally, Niall Murphy is a partner at the Belfast human rights law firm KRW Law. Niall's practice is focused on legacy litigation involving conflict-related deaths and injuries. He's also a leader of the organization Ireland's Future, which is focused on facilitating discussions toward reunification of the island of Ireland. Now, as John said, we're going to make sure to get to your questions in this program. So please submit any questions you have using the Q&A feature on Zoom. The button to use that feature is at the bottom center of your screen. And really don't hesitate to submit questions at any time during the program. We'll scroll back and take a look at them no matter when they're submitted and get to as many as we can. So the way we're gonna structure this discussion is just hear for about 5 minutes from each panelist on their perspectives on these issues. And then we're gonna open it up to a panel discussion. So to get into it, I thought it makes sense to start with Professor Colin Harvey, who's gonna give an overview of where we stand right now.
Good evening. Very much appreciate the invitation to be here tonight, and it's great to see all our friends from Fordham. So I'll try and just very briefly give an overview from my own perspective where I think things are at the moment. I think what I want to do is just address the title of the event this evening, which is essentially what has changed and looking ahead. I'm tempted to say everything has changed in many ways in the last number of years, rather dramatically. But I suppose what has changed? Well, Northern Ireland is out of the European Union. It's out of the European Union essentially without the agreement of its people, and also bearing in mind that the Northern Ireland Assembly didn't agree to the EU withdrawal agreement bill. So out of the European Union, without its agreement and without its consent, the B word Brexit has really had a very dramatic impact in terms of this society. In terms of where we are now, as many of you know, there is a withdrawal agreement and the Irish protocol in that withdrawal agreement. And so the question at the moment, having had that withdrawal agreement implemented in domestic law, is really looking at how that will be implemented going forward. And many of our speakers tonight, I think, will be thinking about the challenges that is involved in that. Brexit and power sharing as well. Many of you will know that the power sharing arrangements here were only restored earlier this year and are, I think it's fair to say, under severe strain. We were promised a new decade and a new approach, and I think it's definitely a new decade, I think is what I would say in relation to that. But it is a power sharing government that's under strain in relation to Brexit, but obviously managing the response to COVID-19 at the moment and all the pressures that is involved. Power sharing government was down for 3 years. We've got essentially a Westminster government at the moment, which is showing, let me try and pick my words carefully here, some hostility to the whole concept of devolution and power sharing. And as we've seen this week from Boris Johnson, skepticism really being fairly openly expressed by the whole idea of devolution itself. But what we've also seen, I think, is extensive EU and international solidarity, really quite remarkable levels of European and international solidarity in defense of the Good Friday Agreement, which I think in itself is something worth noting, in the discussions tonight. Going forward very, very quickly, I think a number of things I want to mention. One is at the moment, obviously a big debate around implementing the withdrawal agreement and the Irish protocol and what we're facing here in 2021, and just a tremendous amount of anxiety around getting that operationalized and working in all its respects in the time ahead. You'll know that there is an internal market bill going through Westminster at the moment, and I see the government lost again a vote today in the House of Lords. There's extreme concern about the content of the internal market bill. I've got a very simple response to the internal market bill. Start again, Boris Johnson. You need to start again. It really is deeply flawed piece of legislation. There's a future relationship agreement, which is being negotiated at the moment. And, for those who want to put down some bets this evening, we're all really waiting to see what will happen about that future relationship. Will a deal be struck? But what sort of deal will be struck? Will, for example, commitment to the Good Friday Agreement be reaffirmed? There's concern about the future of the European Convention on Human Rights. Will we see that hardwired in to the future relationship agreement? I think many people here would like to see that happen. But just like to end really my short contribution with a thought about looking ahead and where things are going next. Spend a lot of time thinking about this, and a lot of the discussion about Brexit can focus on very, very specific challenges around specific aspects of Brexit. But ultimately, I think I've come to the conclusion that Brexit itself is intrinsically constitutional, and we simply have to face into that reality. And I don't think we can avoid it. I think a space is opening up on this island and these islands really for civic and political leaders, a space to walk into really about how we're going to reconfigure relationships constitutionally on this island and across these islands over the course of the next decade. And my own sense is there's a space there for leaders on this island, on these islands, and internationally to take the opportunity that will arise this decade to show leadership, to begin to lead a dialogue on this island, civic dialogue, but also political dialogue, to negotiate and talk, and to show the leadership to negotiate and talk about where this conversation goes next. And for me, and I know Niall will talk about this as well in terms of the work of Ireland's future, that has to involve and include a discussion about the reunification of Ireland. That conversation has been utterly transformed by Brexit. The reunification of this island also means the automatic return to the European Union. And that has been, you've asked what has changed? Well, Brexit has changed everything. And I think that conversation has intensified in a way I have never seen before. So there's an opportunity there. A space is opening up for civic and political leadership to take forward dialogue, to lead negotiations, to take us into a new space, I think, that is going to emerge in the years ahead. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.
And let's turn to Professor Hayward.
Thank you very much, John. Hello, everybody. It's a great privilege to be asked to speak to you today. I've been speaking to a lot of lawyers recently. I began my day 12 hours ago speaking to the Franco-British Lawyers Society, but I'm going to put my sociologist hat on just for my 5 minutes here and share some survey data from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, which is to answer that question, what has changed? And I completely agree with Colin, everything's changed. In particular, what I'm focusing on now is the new fissure that we have in Northern Ireland. We could have done without anymore, but we've got a new one, which is the Leave Remain identity difference. We see this across the UK, of course, but it's very acute in Northern Ireland as well. So I'm just going to share this, I hope. Can you see that okay? Oh gosh, no, I don't want it from beginning. Hang on. Apologies. So essentially, we see this new division in Northern Ireland. This is Northern Ireland Life and Times survey that was conducted last year. We see 52% of people in Northern Ireland saying that they have a Remain identity. That is more or less what we would expect from the Brexit referendum from 2017. 16, 22% saying they're leavers. Perhaps we have some shy leavers, as we expect from some shy nationalists in these surveys, hiding in the don't knows, or they don't think of themselves that way. But essentially, we see a significant divide here. Also interesting is the fact that this leave remain identity is very strong. So 63% of Remainers say that they hold that identity very strongly. And similarly to, although they're a smaller group in Northern Ireland, leavers think of themselves as being very strong leavers as well. Now, if we compare this with Unionist and Nationalist identities, about 30% of Unionists and Nationalists say they hold that identity very strongly, and more say they hold it fairly strongly. So again, we see the intensity of that Leave Remain division, and it's a very significant one. Of course, people are therefore keeping a close eye on what happens in Northern Ireland's relationship with the EU. And then to pick up on this question of, which Colin is moving towards there, on what difference Brexit makes to United Ireland. And steadily over the past few years, as we've been conducting this Northern Ireland Life and Time survey, we've seen an increasing number of people say that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. And unsurprisingly, we've seen a big growth amongst nationalist respondents saying that they see United Ireland being made more likely by Brexit. So 77% of nationalists say this is the case. And Unionists tend to sit in the area of saying that Brexit has made no difference to whether United Ireland is likely or not. And then another crunch question is, well, does Brexit change your mind about United Ireland? And 25% of respondents saying it makes them more in favour. Unsurprisingly, we see huge response from nationalist respondents saying it makes them more in favour of United Ireland. And then 54% saying it makes no difference. And again, most Unionists are resting in that area. What is interesting in that regard is we don't see a huge amount of Unionists saying it makes them makes United Ireland less likely or makes them less in favour of United Ireland. So I want to conclude. I'll stop sharing my screen by that. I just want to conclude by saying we see, definitely to pick up on Colin's points, the sense that Brexit is constitutionally significant, and it's also significant in terms of polarisation and changing identities and strength of identities within Northern Ireland. And we face a huge challenge in terms of how to manage those differences going forward.
And Niall, your group is involved in facilitating some of those discussions, moving towards reunification. Could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be invited to speak to the students and staff at Fordham University. We benefit from an intern every year in our own practice here, and it's a very valuable experience for lawyers in our practice, and hopefully for the students that spend their summer with us. So very much obliged to be here. In terms of the civic activism that myself and several others, many others, hundreds others, thousands others are involved in, we have formed an organisation called Ireland's Future, and it emerged as a people's response, a civic movement to the abuse of democracy, which is Brexit. And as citizens, we were outraged at being hauled out of the European Union, hauled away from birth rights and citizenship rights that will affect our day-to-day lives. It was a conversation that was happening in the street, in coffee shops, at the bar of court before the judge would come out, at the side of football pitches, at the school car park before you pick your kids up. This is the debate of the day. And in response to that, a lot of people, sensible people, decided we can't stand idly by in the issue of our generation. So we penned a public letter to the Taoiseach, who at that time was Leo Varadkar in Dublin, as Northern citizens expressing our concern about the abuse of democracy which was being visited upon us. And we've touched a nerve. The letter it was signed by 200 prominent citizens in the North from all strata of life, from all of the professions, but from the arts, from the community sector, high-profile sportsmen, and the outpouring of energy that was the response to that letter manifested itself at a public debate. Now, I just want to share my screen here myself, if you would allow me 1 moment. If you could see that, can you see that? So we held a public event at the Waterfront Hall in Belfast. That's the literature from it, and the response was amazing. 2,000 people. It's the largest civic attendance to consider a national emergency, really, that has occurred here, certainly this century. It was addressed by the leaders of all of the pro-Remain parties on the island of Ireland. It was addressed by ministers of state, the education minister in the south, Joe McHugh from Fine Gael, the deputy leader of Fianna Fáil, Dara Calleary, the leader of the SDLP. You see there, Colm Eastwood, the leader of Sinn Féin, Marie-Lou McDonald. Our esteemed colleague Colin made a very significant address that day as well. And that event energised civic society even further. We have since corresponded with the Taoiseach on 2 further occasions, most principally this time last year, in a letter that was signed by David McWilliams, who's the foremost economist in Ireland, possibly Europe, Fintan O'Toole, he won last night the columnist of the year, and sports people, musicians, but 1,000 citizens, 2/3 of whom were from the south. And our analysis has evolved to the extent that with Brexit, and Brexit doesn't occur in a vacuum, there are other tectonic plates which are shifting in Ireland. The demographic situation in the north most certainly is changing. And our analysis evolved to the extent whereby we consider that constitutional change is inevitable. It will happen. And it is reckless for governments not to prepare for that. And we appealed to the Taoiseach this time last year to convene a citizens' assembly. It's a constitutional mechanism whereby the issue of constitutional change can be debated, and a recommendation for a referendum question can arise from it. It is the mechanism that worked to great effect in the 2 constitutional referenda which occurred in the South in recent years in relation to marriage equality and the repeal of the 8th Amendment in relation to abortion. So we identified that as a to-do, a responsible thing for the government to do, and regretfully that respectful overture has been declined. There has since been a global pandemic and a general election. There is a new administration in place now, Micheál Martin, and I see one of the questions in the panel there. We'll maybe get to it later. Micheál Martin has declined to convene a citizens' assembly and has ruled out the possible calling of a border poll. A border poll has been described as reckless. It's not. It's a feature, a democratic feature of the Good Friday Agreement. And we're just going to scroll on down here, if you forgive me a moment. Have I passed it? Apologies, I skipped on past it there. But it's the constitutional outworking of the Good Friday Agreement. Here we are. Schedule 1 of the Good Friday of the Northern Ireland Act, which is the legislation which gives rise to the Good Friday Agreement, specifically legislates for, in law, a border poll. I have resided by consent in a jurisdiction that is not reflective of my constitutional preference, but I accept the principle of consent. And our analysis is such that with Brexit, with the demographic change which is coming, the responsible thing to do is to test the principle of consent, and that is a mechanism of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm conscious of our time. I think I've maybe spoken for too long, but I will be delighted to take up any questions which might arise later on in the evening.
Great, thanks very much. And let's move to this side of the Atlantic now, and Professor Flaherty with your perspectives.
Great. So thank you, John, and thanks to the Irish students for organizing this. As John Rogan mentioned, my involvement with human rights advocacy in Northern Ireland goes back to 1986, the year Ulster said no. And though I've done other things, as in The Godfather, Northern Ireland has a way of pulling you back in just when you think you're getting out. And certainly Brexit has done that lately. And so what I want to talk about is the relationship and effect of Brexit, broadly defined, on some of the key human rights issues confronting Northern Ireland now. And when I mean Brexit broadly defined, I mean this overall push exemplified by the current government to make England glorious again, which includes an antipathy towards human rights, particularly when they are articulated in international documents or international mechanisms. So I really want to just highlight four sets of issues. One, with regard to Brexit itself, strictly speaking, the exit of Northern Ireland from the European Union is going to mean that rights protected under the European Union will no longer be available as such, which includes obviously the right to travel, but also an array of equality rights, which according to Chris McCrudden are actually some of the most effective laws concerning equality that apply within the European Union. Moving beyond that, and Colin Harvey mentioned this, is the status of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is technically not part of the European Union, but is related to it. And one thing that I am heartened to see is that my understanding is the European Union has taken a tough stand not only on the United Kingdom continuing to subscribe to the European Convention, and in fairness, they have not said they would no longer subscribe to it, but in helping to push back against something that the Tory government has long wanted, which is to repeal the 1998 Human Rights Act, which incorporates the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights into UK domestic law, which, by the way, is something that is required by the Good Friday Agreement, and which the Republic did in light of the Good Friday Agreement as well. This has been in the sights of the Conservative government, but as I say, my understanding is the EU has been pushing back and insists that any agreement include the UK's commitment not to repeal that act. Two other things worth mentioning with regard to rights is that go beyond Brexit, strictly speaking, but speak to the antipathy towards international agreements and international rights, is the current plans of the government with regard to legacy. Under the Stormont House Agreement of 2014, there was to be instituted a historical investigations unit to pick up on the work being done by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, as well as an information retrieval unit to deal with legacy issues. Earlier this year, the government introduced a proposal purporting to institute those commitments, but which in effect gut them, in particular by putting a premium on speed in investigations and making it very easy to close for all time investigations of violence coming from the Troubles. And then finally, and this is near and dear to my heart because this is what first got me involved in Northern Ireland, is the pushback against 31 years later having an independent public inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane, which is important not just because of Pat Finucane, but because it exemplifies systemic human rights violations that were occurring at the time. The Finucane family won a signal victory in February of 2019 in the UK Supreme Court in which the UK Supreme Court said that all of the efforts that the UK government had used to have false inquiries or Potemkin Village inquiries did not accord with Britain's commitments under the European Convention of Human Rights as incorporated. Not surprisingly, nothing has come of that decision. The UK government has dragged its feet. The Finucane family was forced to take another judicial review concerning the foot dragging. And stay tuned, there is a deadline of November 30th, by which time the British government has to indicate what it is going to do to fulfill its responsibilities under the judgment, and at long last give a public inquiry into the Finucane matter. And if not, will be held in contempt of court. So we will see what happens with that. But the bottom line in all of this is Brexit comes out of an ethos of antipathy towards the enforcement of rights and international commitments. And that antipathy, I think, becomes another factor that accounts for some of the data that Katie Hayward shared with us, a push towards potentially a united Ireland down the road.
Great. And now let's turn to Jennifer for a discussion of the impact that American lawyers can have.
Thank you. And thank you to Fordham Law for having me here today and for inviting me on this distinguished panel. My name is Jennifer Franco Crawford. I'm the president of the Brehon Law Society. We were founded in 1978, and we are not exclusively Irish or Irish American. We welcome all as concerns for human rights transcends ethnicity. I prepared a statement to share with you. I had the opportunity in 2017 to meet Niall Murphy, and together with the Brehons, we started an internship named in honor of our first president, General Jim Cullen. He himself was a dedicated human rights lawyer. And today I've been asked to speak about what role Americans and American lawyers can play specifically regarding the future of the country. There's no question that the relationship between the island of Ireland and the United States is a strong and a deep bond. And I would imagine that with an incoming president with proud Irish roots, that bond will be even more strengthened. According to the last census, nearly 34.5 million Americans claim heritage that is either primarily or partially Irish. That is nearly 7 times larger than the island of Ireland. There's no doubt that there are millions of connections to this small but mighty island. I often get asked the question, why should we care about what happens in Ireland? And my reply when I think about this is, why should we not care? The Irish diaspora is vast and worldwide. It is even contemplated in their 1916 proclamation with the brief but very deliberate point remembering and referencing our exiled children in America. As Irish Americans, we cannot forget our roots. But even for those who have no direct ties to the island of Ireland, and as a group of lawyers interested in social justice and human rights matters, it is important to ensure that certain fundamental rights and principles are upheld and promoted. Principles such as peace and prosperity, equality, consent, and due process, and even more fundamentally, keeping promises. And America played a significant role in ensuring the peace and prosperity, and that promises were kept on the island of Ireland. We are invested in its peace and prosperity. There is no doubt that Brexit is a threat and assault on these principles. As Dr. King said from his Birmingham jail in 1963, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And meditating upon that, I think about the variety of legal groups that exist to help ensure peace and prosperity on the entire island of Ireland, in the Republic and the 6 counties in the north. The New York City Bar Association Committee on Human Rights, the National Council on American Foreign Policy, both have taken both have taken interest and strong roles in ensuring that. For example, just today, the ad hoc committee to protect the Good Friday Agreement, which is comprised of many lawyers, met for a briefing on the impact of Brexit. This afternoon, the Brehons hosted John Finucane, a member of parliament from North Belfast, for another Brexit briefing. And an update regarding the British government's position on whether or not they will hold the long-awaited public inquiry into the murder of John's father, an adored Belfast human rights lawyer, Pat Finucane, who was murdered in his home in front of his family in 1989 through an act of collusion recognized by the British government. I can't tell you how many US lawyers took a strong interest in Pat's case, and so many more still do today, over 30 years later, to ensure that justice is served for the Finucane family. And we're not just talking about principles here. We're talking about people's lives, their livelihoods, their land, freedom, identity, language, and economy. Many members of the Brehon Law Society have traveled to the North to observe at trials and participate in fact-finding inquiries. They've organized forums, written and presented articles and white papers, testified before Congress and the United Nations on matters germane to human rights in the North, and members have sought to educate all branches of the United States government about the nature and causes of human rights violations in Northern Ireland. We speak to members of Congress who wholeheartedly support the preservation and protection of the Good Friday Agreement on a bipartisan level with the commitment to peace. As lawyers, and as American lawyers, we are in a privileged position to keep a vigilant, watchful eye on any threat to justice anywhere, including any threat to the principles and tenets of the Good Friday Agreement. And equally, we have no fear to take action to preserve and protect it. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to all the panelists for their initial insights here. We're going to get to audience questions in just a second. A number have come in, and feel free to continue submitting them. But before getting there, we just wanted to open it up, for a quick conversation among the panel. So if anyone has heard anything in another panelist's remark that you'd like to comment on, please feel free. We can.
I'll break the silence and actually ask, in particular, Niall and Colin, what they think is the greatest threat to human rights in light of Brexit, whether narrowly or broadly defined.
I think one of the great fears that has been expressed in the context of Brexit is, will this affect our access to the European Court of Human Rights? And the immediate simple answer is no, because Brexit does not take Britain out of the remit of the European Convention of Human Rights. And just to pause on the convention, it was written by right-wing British Conservative MPs. One of whom was part of the liberation delegation to the concentration camps. And, the composition of the European Convention of Human Rights was born of that experience that they can never allow man to commit that evil in Europe again. So it doesn't, but I always found it interesting that Theresa May, who was anti-Brexit, as Home Secretary, lobbied strongly to repeal the Human Rights Act and to take Britain out of the European Convention of Human Rights. And Brexit, in my respectful analysis, is the arrogance of English nationalism committed to referendum. And Britain felt that their legal sovereignty was being impinged by European courts. And in many respects, Theresa May was right. The European courts were a bulwark against some of the actions that she wanted to conduct as Home Secretary. And she was frustrated from doing so by the European Convention and by the court. So Brexit doesn't take Britain out of that. It doesn't absolve them of their responsibilities in that regard. And to the extent that Irish people want to litigate, as our practice does, in respect of rights abused and rights denied historically, that won't change. But for me, the event of Brexit smooths the path towards a repeal of the Human Rights Act. And that is the huge concern, as grossly agitating as Brexit is in terms of trade and access to the instruments of the European Union. If we were to lose access and supervision of the European Court of Human Rights, that would be the time that alarm bells are ringing already, re-Brexit, but they should be ringing much louder if Britain attempted to take itself out of the European Convention. And Boris, I think, Colin would address this more attentively than I, but Boris, it was on his agenda, and he had the political niche not to pursue that. But in terms of live threats in the human rights context, that's what I would consider. I'm sure Colin would probably address the absence of a Bill of Rights, which was obviously agreed on the Good Friday Agreement, and that's meant to be being resolved by New Decade, New Approach. But the executive's performance last week in response to the ongoing pandemic was politically appalling. The invocation of the minority rights veto in a pandemic and a public health issue was a political disgrace. So I would observe, for what it's worth, that there are political difficulties here, and the commitments made less than a year ago are already ringing hollow, and the Bill of Rights is one of those political commitments.
Thank
you. Just very, very quickly, first of all, legally, people will know there's nothing like EU law in UK domestic law, right, in terms of what it gives you. You've already mentioned its importance in relation to equality, but also in relation to rights. And the removal of that obviously causes tremendous concern and anxiety. Obviously, the European Union and the Council of Europe, they're two separate entities, and in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the court goes on. But obviously, in the political declaration, there was a commitment in relation to the European Convention on Human Rights. From the EU's perspective, there's obviously a worry there about, in a number of areas of cooperation, if the UK was to step away from that convention, there would be really serious concerns about future cooperation. So I think it's absolutely important that that commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights is hardwired into the future relationship agreement. Also, in some of the questions, people will know in the protocol, one of the intriguing things about the protocol given Northern Ireland is historically human rights and equality were often the subject of a lot of quite contentious debate. But a Human Rights and Equality Commission sort of flowed all the way through the process, relatively unamended, and is now there, Article 2. And I don't know what Katie thinks, but I think there's going to be lawyers spending years and years and years litigating, and judges and lawyers are going to be headaches trying to work out what Article 2 of the protocol means. But it's there. But obviously, there's a lot of anxiety about what Brexit means for human rights and equality in the future. Obviously, the Conservative Party has made noises about repealing the Human Rights Act. They're now talking about updating it, and there's been further discussion today about what that might mean and the review that they're proposing around the Human Rights Act. So there's a worry about what the future holds for human rights, and it goes back to Martin's point as well about that it reflects a sort of antipathy towards these values. So I think that's the concern, that's the worry. I think we'll see what happens in relation to the no diminution commitment in the protocol in Article 2. We'll see if there's reference to the European Convention on Human Rights and Domestic Law, and we'll see what happens to the Human Rights Act in the UK going forward. I think the Conservative current government thinks, I think it is done away with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, right? So, and they've provided for its repeal. But I have a little feeling that the Charter of Human Rights is going to indirectly re-emerge via the various mechanisms that are there around implementation and enforcement, what we'll see. but obviously a worrying time for human rights. Just a final point is what's been interesting this year to see the revival here of the Bill of Rights process here with a Northern Ireland Assembly committee at the moment, which is actually taking evidence and has launched a consultation on the long stalled but recently revived Bill of Rights process, which, you know, people should participate in and make their views known on, I think. Thank you.
And of course, trade has been a major focus of these discussions, and that's the subject of the first audience question that I'd like to get to. A audience member asking for the panelists' views on cross-border trade, travel, and currency.
I'm happy to take that question if you like. Apologies for the noise in the background. I've got 3 guinea pigs beside me, so random. So yeah, so in essence, what the protocol manages to do, which is the protocol as part of the withdrawal agreement, is ensure that there'll be no change to cross-border trade on the island of Ireland. So free movement of goods continues on the island of Ireland, no matter whether the UK has a deal with the EU or not. And what has happened with the protocol is, in effect, we have the customs border and the single market border for the EU for goods moved into the Irish Sea. The sensitivity about calling that a border, but in essence, there will be checks and controls on that border, and that's in effect what it is. So this means that we will continue to have free movement of goods. We won't have free movement of services unless there's a deal on that. And so there's a huge amount riding on the UK having a deal with the EU, as it directly affects Northern Ireland in a very different way to the way it would affect GB, but for free movement of services on the island, for data sharing, for criminal justice cooperation, etc. We would be hoping to see a deal in that regard. And just on that point, Colin reminds me of it. I mean, if the UK gets what it wants in terms of security cooperation with the EU is very insistent, of course, on human rights standards being maintained. And that is one way in which, not to the degree that we'd be looking for, but that principle of subscription to the ECHR is there in the EU's approach to these matters. So that will be something to keep an eye on. And currency isn't affected by this at all. The movement of people is not British and Irish people, but we won't be seeing passport checks on the Irish border for EU citizens. But we will be seeing changes, of course, for EU citizens who are seeking to get jobs, etc., in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland, has to follow the UK-wide regime on immigration.
Great, thanks. And, of course, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, and we had a question that touches on that issue. Would anyone be able to speak to the impact of Brexit's immigration policies on Northern Ireland's healthcare system?
I'd be happy to speak to that. I personally had a very serious brush with COVID-19 earlier in the year. I was delighted to be an honoured guest at the Breathing Loss Society's St. Patrick's Day dinner, and unfortunately I took ill on the way home. Don't know where I got it. Could have been in Dublin Airport, as easy as JFK, but I ended up in intensive care for 17 days in a coma on a ventilator, and was in hospital for 28 days, off work for 6 months. So I had a very sharp experience of our health service here and the absolutely heroic work which is done on our behalf silently in our intensive care units and in the COVID wards as they became. And I would say more than half of the nurses and doctors that attended with me came from the European Union, be it Polish porters or Eastern European nurses, and even nurses from outside the EU, from the Philippines. There's an awful lot of Filipino nurses. It was a chastening, inspiring life experience that these people who had no interest or knowledge of me were so attentive and caring and got me back on my feet. And I would fear, I've made it my business, I've made good friends in the nursing profession, and I'm told that huge thousands of nurses from the nursing registrar have left since June 2016 because of just the feeling that there was a more xenophobic feeling which pervaded our society, and the nurses didn't feel welcome and have left. And there are tens of thousands of shortage of nurses on the nursing registrar here, and I fear, and it's one shared by a very senior nursing unions, that's a direct impact of Brexit. Another impact of Brexit, specifically on COVID, is the oddity or bizarre incidents whereby the oxygen, so when you're being ventilated, the ventilator breathes for you, and the oxygen which is pumped in through the ventilator is made by the British oxygen company, BO2, and its oxygen resource in Ireland is actually manufactured in the south. And the north, the hospitals in the north have run out of oxygen because there are so many people that are requiring it. And we are having to share stock, albeit with a British company, but who are manufacturing their oxygen in the south. In a post-Brexit situation, we don't know how that trade would be transacted, because that's what it is. In our meetings, we have convened many meetings, more so by webcast since the pandemic, and we've held discussions with Professor Gabriel Scally, who has emerged as the Dr. Fauci on this side of the Atlantic. Very, very learned nobleman. The trade union representative for all of the general practitioners, the GPs here. And they're hypothesizing of circumstances whereby you might have a Polish ambulance driver who lives in Letterkenny, which is ostensibly a border town, but is employed, and this is a live fact, is employed at Altnagelton Hospital, maybe 20 miles away from his home, but he has to cross a border every day. And will he have the liberty to work inside and outside the European Union? And the skill deficit, I've already described it in the context of our nursing profession that has been exited by thousands of EU nurses. You know, is it going to get worse? There really is a dark spectre which could yet visit us all within weeks. It's the 1st of January. We don't know what's happening. The protocols aren't in place. The British government are legislating and proactively saying we're going to break the law. We're going to break the Good Friday Agreement. The privilege that I have had over the years to speak to Irish America, who there would have been no peace deal without your influence, inspiration and support, is that the pride that you repose correctly in the Good Friday Agreement, but perhaps incorrectly that it's a settled issue. It's not. And Brexit, and the British government have already said this, is going to drive a cart and horses through the Good Friday Agreement, and have said they will disregard an internationally binding treaty. How could anybody in trust or honesty engage and reasonably negotiate with an entity that so candidly and flippantly commits itself to breaking the law and breaking international agreement? And as I say, we're weeks away, and it's not good. We've very grave concerns coming at us fast.
Can I just respond to that? We do all have very grave concerns, but I wouldn't want to give the wrong impression about what I'm not saying you're giving the wrong impression, but I would want to reassure people that medicines will continue, like medicine is covered by the protocol. And we did, the concern about that was that medicines registered or produced in GB wouldn't be able to come into Northern Ireland, and that's been resolved, or that's been agreed. That's one of the few things that have been agreed on the in the specialized committee for implementing the protocol. And similarly, that issue you're right to raise about frontier workers on the other side of the border, on the southern side of the border, being able to work here. Again, it is a major concern, but there are frontier worker permits coming forward to address that. It's not ideal. I'm not justifying it, but I am saying those are being addressed and have been addressed to some degree.
Well, thanks very much for highlighting that critical issue, and now we're all very happy to see you doing so much better. We only have time for a couple more questions, but the next one I have on my list here is how would you ensure Unionists and their British identity are protected in a united Ireland?
I'm happy to take it, but I'm conscious that I've probably spoken for too long. And in that regard, you know, it goes without saying that the full identity and citizenship that any citizen aspires to will be absolutely protected. And it's, you know, a misnomer that would not be the case. We already live, you know, Colin lectures at the Queen's University of Belfast. It's not going to be changed to Belfast University. Our streets are multiply ordained with Great Victoria Street and Chichester Street and Donegal Place. Those street names will not change. Statues will not come down in the City Hall. We all speak English. The British identity will be as nurtured and cherished as significant identity on the island as it is now, as it will be in the event of constitutional change. The British identity is exceptionally well represented by articulate, persuasive, well-connected political representation, some magnificent advocates, and far be it for me to speak on their behalf, but I have full confidence in their ability to ensure nothing less than full respect and citizenship for their identity, and rightly so. I would not want to be in a part of any constitutional single island entity whereby that wasn't the case. I have experience of it in my lifetime of having my identity attacked, infringed, and denigrated, and I would not visit that upon anybody, much less my community neighbour.
Maybe could I just say something very briefly? In some sense, I didn't say what I said lightly, you know, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this in the last few years, because stepping into this space in this society, you do with a bit of trepidation. I really do genuinely think this island could be and is being propelled into a space where there needs to be planning and preparation for a range of outcomes, including the one that we're talking about now. I think in doing that, you know, just as been outlined, we'll be doing it within the framework of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, which will carry forward as well into whatever might emerge next. Also, the values that are there around mutual respect, parity of esteem, human rights and equality, that themselves are not fully implemented in the here and now. And that's one of the problems now. It would be easier to have this conversation if some of these things were operational as we speak. But I do think, you know, just as it's been outlined, it's a great opportunity to have the conversation about the sort of shape of the society we want in the future, which has to be a welcoming place for everyone who shares this island. Because nobody, I think, listening to nobody wants to repeat where we've been, right? And, you know, so we want to learn and move forward in a better way. And like, some of the points that have been made come from a space of people who know what the past was like and don't want to go there again. And that's why so much, like what's really struck me about so much that's been said by the organizations involved, actually including Ireland's Future and others, is the clear emphasis on preparation, of doing your homework first. So before you, I'm not going to mention any B words where that mightn't have been done right, but do the homework first, make sure you've thought it through, and then take whatever steps people want to step into. And like for me, in the area that I work in, human rights and equality, look, I'd be very, very clear in either of our cities, right, tonight, if now and in the future on this island, if there's a child going hungry tonight anywhere on the island in any city, we'll have failed. And, if there's somebody sleeping on the streets tonight, whether now or in the future, in whatever constitutional configuration we have, then we'll fail. So, I think I'm interested both in the conversation about the Good Friday Agreement, but also, like a lot of us are interested, as well as a transformative conversation about human rights and equality. And, whatever we step into next, that it's better, right? It's an improvement. Many of us involved in this conversation for one simple reason. Look, this isn't working. What we have now doesn't work. The arrangements we have don't work, and we can do so much better. And some of us have reached the conclusion we could do so much better together on this island, but human rights and equality have to be absolutely core to that. And the values of the Good Friday Agreement have to be absolutely core to that as well.
If I could just jump in from a sort of comparative American constitutional perspective, it strikes me that one way to guarantee the British Unionist identity and provide a measure of comfort seems to me obvious. And then in another regard, the solutions are not obvious at all, which I think underlines Colin's plea and invitation to have discussion and preparation. The thing that strikes me as obvious is the thing that I don't think has been fully realized, which is a commitment to a truly independent judiciary, which has a robust enforcement of both domestic and international law human rights standards. And it's the gap between that ideal and that reality that lawyers like Niall have had to deal with, and before him, Pat Finucane. And so, that I think is a solution that applies, in many different countries and many different contexts. What is utterly not clear to me is what sort of constitutional arrangement might be needed or necessary in terms of local self-government, forms of federalism, devolution, drawing upon analogous situations in other countries. And I think precisely because that's not clear, that's exactly why there needs to be discussion and scholarship and preparation, as Colin says, before things go forward in a concrete way.
Terrific. Well, we'll have to end it there. I just want to thank all of our speakers. This has been such an informative and thought-provoking panel. So, thanks very much for generously, taking your time to share your insights with us. And I also want to thank everyone out there in the audience for joining us. We really appreciate it. And John, did you want to close us out?
Yeah, thanks again, especially to our panelists. A virtual round of applause, I feel, is warranted. Thank you again for taking the time out to discuss this issue. We hope to continue these conversations in the future, certainly next semester and beyond that, as the situation continues to evolve. So we thank you for lending your expertise and participating tonight. Again, thank you to all of our attendees. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but again, we see this as hopefully a continuing dialogue, and we look forward to future conversations that we're able to hold in a similar way. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks. Good seeing everybody.